Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast where we interview creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name is Phillip Russell, and I'm here with my co-host,
Ben Thorp.
And today, I'm really excited to talk about our interview with Gina Nutt about her new essay collection, Night Rooms, published by $2 Radio. They describe it as a poetic collection of personal essays that weaves together fragmented images from horror films and cultural tropes to meditate on anxiety and depression, suicide, body image, identity, and grief. Ben, this was a great conversation.
Yeah, this is a great conversation, and I think you and I were both drawn to this because of the way that Gina is able to, in a really, I think, almost poetic way, weave in these different horror movies. And you know, I think you and I kind of before the interview were really having this conversation about the ways that you can bring kind of outside media into a thing and to kind of make it your own. Intertextuality, right? Like, how do you make this thing for someone who hasn't seen whatever horror movie you're referencing? How do you make it feel resonant and relevant? And Gina's, I think, really good at that.
Yeah, it's funny. We recently were talking about a YouTube video about fashion and how the host was kind of using Marvel to talk about intertextuality, and Ben and I kind of came down to this point of outside of academia, intertextuality can feel almost like a cheap trick, as something that you can easily lean on and without doing the work. And I think in my own personal writing, I have had some aversion to, or some discomfort in being very referential to the real world and, you know, pop culture and things that I like. And that's something I've had to get over. And Nutt's collection does such a great job of interweaving her personal connection to horror films and other types of media in really unexpected and interesting ways. And I think partially that's just from the juxtaposition that exists in this collection of, like, each essay is essentially a collage or a segmented piece where she brings in stories, anecdotes, actual scenes, quotes from all over and kind of smashes them together in this really poetic and interesting way, and gives the reader a lot of chance to bring their own conclusions.
Yeah, and the other thing Nutt often does is like recreate the scene within the essay, so that even if you haven't seen It Follows or you haven't seen Jaws or, you know, whatever she's referencing, you'll be kind of like, it's as though you're kind of watching this horror movie over her shoulder in some ways, where you're kind of watching her kind of sit in this scene and perceive the scene alongside her. And the other thing that you're kind of getting into is like this collage where oftentimes I really admire the way that she's able to just like paint these emotions without you even realizing it's kind of happening until you reach the end of an essay, because you'll get a lot of kind of tiny moments or little scenes. Are they from her life? Are they from a movie? You know, they're mixed together, and you're not always sure where it's going until you kind of hit that ending and you're like, oh, you know, this collage of things has suddenly added up to, you know, a piece about grief or a piece about fear or a piece about like despair. And so they just fit together in such a great way that's, yeah, just very moving.
Yeah, and I always feel that I know I found a really good piece of literature when it's able to take something that has kind of been bubbling in my subconscious for a long time and bring it to the surface and put words to maybe a feeling that I've had that I haven't been able to articulate myself. And Gina does such a good job of elucidating a lot of points that I've maybe felt about horror and its ability to allow us to safely experience potentially traumatic or hard situations, and what that says about our relationship to, you know, those hard experiences. So yeah, it was a really eye-opening kind of conversation, and made me reappreciate why I do like horror in the first
Yeah.
place.
And I think that's such a good point because I think I'm someone who's like a big baby about horror. And so it's like I don't often find a way kind of into it. It feels like it's a genre that like it can be unwelcoming if you're kind of coming in cold, right? If you're like not down to see someone's arm get ripped off for whatever reason, like it can be something that's difficult to get into. And I think she's able to do this thing where she invites you in to kind of mess with and play with like the undercurrents of a lot of horror in a way that it is, I think, very welcoming.
For sure. And yeah, how about we not spoil any of what actually happens in there, but there's some surprising moments in there for y'all to hear.
Let's get to it. No hot takes from us. They're all from Gina.
Roll the clip.
Gina Nutt is the author of the essay collection Night Rooms and the poetry collection Wilderness Champion. She earned her MFA from Syracuse University. Her writing has appeared in Cosmonauts Avenue, Joyland, Ninth Letter, and other publications. Gina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and to talk with you.
Gina, your book has been out for, I think, just a little bit over a month. How are you feeling, and what has the reception to the book been like so far?
I'm feeling really good about it. I wasn't entirely sure what I could expect or hope for, so I came in just thinking, just see what happens. And so I've been really warmed by the response from readers, booksellers, podcasters. You know, folks have really rallied for this book, and it's been really lovely to, in the capacity I can, talk with folks and do virtual events, and I've loved getting to meet people to the extent that I can over the internet and at virtual events. I love that we've pivoted and made space for people to be able to celebrate their books. So it's been really wonderful.
Yeah, have you been able to set foot in a bookstore since I guess the pandemic kicked off at all?
So we have two local bookstores that I love here in Ithaca, and they've both offered curbside, or you can go in and browse while wearing a mask. So I've been able to stay in books and support those local stores. So it's been really lovely to visit and keep my stacks nice and tall. Right.
How did you kind of land on choosing $2 Radio as the publisher? What was kind of the story behind Night Rooms? Night Rooms is like genesis.
Yeah, so I found $2 Radio back in 2015. That was my first encounter with them, which, as I understand it, is somewhat late for them because they've been around since 2008. And I picked up Sarah Gerard's Binary Star. And that novel, it's such a brief, poetic, lyrical novel. It just blew me away. It was unlike a lot of books that I was reading at the time. And I loved it. And from there, I kept them on my radar as a press. I wanted to keep reading, and I wanted to keep knowing their authors. And so eventually, when I had this book that I was thinking about taking next steps with, $2 Radio was at the top of my list. And I think initially I wasn't sure, how it would work out, but I sent over submittable, no agent or anything like that. I just sent from the slush, and I love that about them, that for $3, they'll let you send your manuscript in, because I came to submitting from poetry, where I had been doing the contest circuit. So oftentimes I was submitting books for $25 or $28, each time I sent a book out, a collection of poems. So this felt just kind of really lucky to me, not only that I liked their books, but that it was like really reasonable. I just felt really good about that. I think the way they phrased it on their submittable was, you're buying us a cup of coffee for while we're reading your book. And I was like, I like that. I'm down with that, And so I sent to them, and they had the book for just shy of a year. And I heard from Eric, who's one of the editors there, and Eric reached out over email and said, I'm liking this book. Is it still available? And I was just like, this isn't real. I was like, this can't be. I like ran around my house, very excited. So not cool. But they ended up asking if they could publish it, and I was so delighted to work with Eric and Eliza. They're just wonderful people. And so that's how I linked up with them. Was I sent through Slush open, they have a year-round reading period, and I just took a chance on it because I loved their work and thought maybe they'd be into it. So yeah, I was really lucky.
Yeah, no agent. I'm like kind of staggered by that. That's really cool.
Yeah.
We have what I think this question about, and you're kind of talking about starting in poetry and doing the poetry circuit. I think I've always started to feel like the boundary line between especially kind of prose poetry and creative nonfiction is really thin. And I felt that through a lot of these essays, that they have kind of a poetic quality to them. And so I'm wondering if you want to talk about like what the line for you is between those two things, and what the genesis for these as essays as opposed to as poems was.
Sure. So I think initially my earliest impulse when I came to the first essay that I wrote, it was a really sad time in my life. It was following the death of my father-in-law, and I was having a really just impossible time writing, and was thinking a lot about death and just feeling very, very like hopeless in a sense, and almost like, what does writing accomplish? And I'm someone who writes every day, so I was like, well, I'm going to write about death, and we're going to just lean into this place. And I think initially I tried to maybe make them poems. I had words going across a page. I had just all kinds of weird arrangements. And then finally I was like, we're just going to collapse these into paragraphs, all these thoughts, and just follow the images and follow the feelings. And so I wrote toward the first essay that I wrote for the book. And I spent about a year on that. And as I worked, I was keeping notes. I was writing toward other movies or other life experiences beyond this particular death. And then when I was ready to send that essay out, I wasn't ready to leave the premise. So I kept growing it. And the idea of, okay, I'm writing a book was initially kind of daunting to me. So I did trick myself and say, you're just writing one prose poem after another, because that for me that's how I start writing everything. I write in a journal, and it's just it's all in prose. Lineation, when I do use it for poems, often comes later in revision. But I love the momentum you can get of thought and of detail when you just lean into the sentences and follow it. Because you can always cut later. You can always prune and add more if you want. I go the opposite way, where I take things out, and I do find that a lot of my revision ends up being expansion and compression, where I'll really write these long, just everything in the kitchen sink drafts. And then later, after I've had some time, I'll just prune and pull back a bit and, see if the ghost of what was there remains, and the ghost of the feelings that were initially conjured, can that stand? It doesn't always work, but, sometimes it does. And when it does, this is the result when it works out well.
What was the first essay, out of curiosity, that kind of helped shape the book into what it would eventually become?
So it was the essay about It Follows and anxiety. But there are, yeah, I love the response to that. That's fantastic. I also have some bits that are in the beginning and the end. So I ended up breaking that essay apart and putting some of the beginning at the beginning of the book and some of the end towards the end of the book. And as I grew the manuscript, that essay served as a kind of scaffolding Because for a book like this, it's nice to have those signposts. Like, I need to have some idea of where I'm going. I don't have to have it all figured out, but having some clarity, I think it was important for me. And I know as I continued working and thinking about sharing it eventually, I knew it would be important for readers to have some steady footing, because I can be dreamy and lyric all I want, but if I want to welcome people into this space, I think it's really important to give a reader solid ground, to invite them rather than exclude them and just be like, oh, this is my dream. You know, that's cool. That's fine. But I want people to be here with me.
Yeah.
I sorry, Phil, go ahead.
Well, just to kind of go down that road a little bit further, thinking about, you know, the form of the collection, you know, when I might call it like a collage or like a segmented essay collection, or, you know, it has some of that DNA, at least within the individual essays. And one thing I found when I'm working on essays that are kind of taking a bunch of different elements and juxtaposing them in order to make like this broader statement is that emergent aspect of it that you're talking about, of like, you know, the It Follows essay started as one thing, and then you realize like, oh shit, I can like break it up and it becomes like a bigger thing for these other essays, is a really interesting kind of dynamic for essay writing that isn't always the case. And I'm wondering just like how that experience was for you as you continued to unravel this collection. Like, what was the process of figuring out how you were, you know, composing the individual essays?
Yeah, so it definitely emerged as I worked. It would have taken me so much less time if I'd had like a clear proposal or outline. I'm in awe of writers who can do that, who like sell a book on proposal and then write it after. Mm-hmm. Like that would take me, I don't know if I could do it. So to find the pockets or the different essays, the different turns the book takes, I had an ongoing Word doc where I was just writing these prose, you know, paragraphs. And then eventually I started cutting up note cards, which I color coded to different threads within the book. So blue, those cards stood for movies. Purple cards stood for childhood. Yellow cards stood for death or death culture in the United States, which weaves throughout. And I taped them on the wall. And I started moving pieces around or taking them out or adding new pieces that weren't in the Word doc and writing towards those. So in a way, being able to see everything laid out in that collage sense or taped up on the wall really gave me a clear sense of the larger arc and all the threads I was trying to hold and all those themes. I loved the note cards. I had them up for a year. It was, you know, sometimes they would fall or like the cats would mess with them, and you know, it would kind of be like, where was this piece? Like, I'd have to remember, or if something fell away and I lost it for a few weeks and just forgot it was there, I was like, well, I guess that wasn't important. So, but I think having that physical sense of collage was really important to not only finding the different things I was writing about, but also finding what ended up being, you know, a push towards the ultimate arc of the book and the shape of it.
And you know, was it the case that you were like, you would have certain, you know, horror movies up in certain places, and then you'd be like, oh, you know, I want this actually makes more sense over in this essay over here. And so it was kind of, you had a lot of moments, and it was finding where the moments or the kind of pieces fit the most kind of thematically with the essay you were kind of crafting.
Yeah, there were a few cases, I think, where I ended up moving movies, or, you know, I had really brief writings about, you know, like the movie Revenge was one where I was writing about that movie, and I was like, I don't know if I'm going to write that essay, but then I ended up writing that essay and writing towards it because I kept pulling in other movies. And I think for me, like, just being able to see it all laid out really helped to say, okay, well, this actually should be its own thing. Like the dream essay where I write about Nightmare on Elm Street, that ended up becoming its own essay about dreams and sleep and the weird uncanny parallels between sleep and death, which for some reason to me was, I don't know, something that I got really stuck on for a while, despite how brief that essay is. But that was originally part of a different essay, but I let it have its own little brief moment, because I thought it would stand better on its own. So that ended up happening too. Sometimes I wanted things to shine more, feel more separate. The ocean essay too, I think the first and second essays were, I had initially bled them together, but I broke them and was like, okay, this is all ocean, water. This is all kind of the lead in. So those first two were initially one.
Can you maybe talk about how you came up with this? Obviously, as we're kind of already talking about, a lot of them use horror movies as kind of a framing. And one of the things that I think works really well is the way you're able to, it's not just kind of references to those movies. It's almost like we're sitting with you as you're watching those movies, that you'll kind of play out the scene. And I kind of had that reaction to the It Follows one, because that first scene from It Follows where the girl is running around and her dad can't see what's chasing her.
I'm fine, Dad.
Which is like really powerful in the movie, was like rendered in such a way in this essay that it like also is impactful in like a similar way. And so, yeah, how did you think about bringing that in and making that, both work as a framing device and also work as something that, I think someone who hasn't maybe seen those movies can still feel like they're participating in a way, or it's like present in a way that it's still working?
So I think definitely I was trying to tap into that full body experience of watching a horror movie and observing it, which now seems really distant because I haven't like watched a horror movie in a theater, but that full immersion, it's such a specific, real thing. I think that's true of any movie, but I think especially for horror, there's something very specific that you get out of watching it on a large screen, potentially sharing that experience with strangers in a dark room. Like, that just seems unreal to me now. But I wanted to conjure that and give people that memory on the page. But I also wanted it to be open to people who maybe weren't as versed in horror or as familiar with some of these movies or any of them. So I tried to tap into this idea of kind of the collective consciousness of horror. So, okay, we know the Nightmare Man. A lot of people know that's going to be Freddy Krueger, the man who like comes into your dreams and kills you or tries to. So it ended up being kind of a trick that I lifted from fable or folklore, like the woman in the desert, or so instead of using character names, I was giving all the people I was writing about just these kind of general, almost folkloric names. It's kind of like, well, we know how this ends for the mistress, or we know how this ends for the babysitter in the old house at night. We just have this kind of cultural code, I think, for those things that are frightening, or those situations that are dangerous, or people who are typically in danger. So I leaned into that and tried to use that as a device to, maybe you don't have to know the name of the movie because it's the situation that's familiar. It's the premise that frightens us. There's a little bit of distance there.
Yeah, I felt that you did such a good job of articulating something that I kind of implicitly felt about horror. Like, I'm somebody who grew up and loved horror movies. Growing up, my mom would, when my brother was acting up, she'd be like, "Oh, I'm gonna call Freddy if you don't, get your act together," or whatever. So like it's always been a part of my life, and I think that the book does a good job of, in some ways, showing the joy that can be found in watching the genre because of something that you point out of like this call and response. How if you are privy to the tropes of the genre, it kind of allows you to engage with it. And I almost would call it like, it feels like a safe space. Like you're dealing with a very traumatic event, but it's kind of a safe space because you can kind of anticipate what's supposed to happen in these really trying, traumatic experiences. And the It Follows essay, just kind of going back to that one, that felt so expertly placed in the collection because it almost feels like the collection is breaking open there. It's this film that kind of goes against a lot of horror tropes, and you point out how you search the screen looking for where the evil is, and hopefully like if you could find it, maybe you can stop it from happening. I guess I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about this rumination on call and response, because it felt so elucidating to me just thinking about the genre, and I'd love for listeners to just hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think too that when if you go back, that a lot of horror movies are in conversation with each other. They're all kind of learning from each other. They're all, in a sense, they're all in a lineage. They're all calling back to everything that came before, which in a lot of ways, all art does that, right? It's calling back to everything that came before. But horror has a very particular way of doing it, or several, if we're thinking of like franchises. I mean, how many Freddy movies are there? How many Jason movies are there? So there's that aspect of it. But then there's also the aspect of, a movie like It Follows, where it takes all our expectations and all the fear, all the things that we've come to know and love about the genre, and I think it's almost painful at points to watch that movie, how it really builds the anticipation. There are times where, as you mentioned, watching It Follows, you might see someone in the background walking very slowly, and you think, is that the monster? Is that it? And it's not. It's just a person. Which is a really intense experience. When I recall like seeing that in theaters for the first time, it just had it had a big impact on me. And I had that movie did not let me go. It followed me. And it definitely came up when I was writing that first essay, when I was thinking about, in particular, deaths in my life, particularly those people in my life who've chosen suicide. And I was thinking about this sense of mental health and suicide and these choices that other people make following me, in a sense. And there was, I think, a sense of desperation, like if I can pinpoint where someone's making this choice or what to look for. And I think that was definitely something I was grappling with at the time. And I think I still do. I think it's unavoidable for a lot of people who have that experience, to let it go and to just stop thinking, oh, if I can just call it next time. But I think that's what makes it, I think that's something that a lot of people experience. Yeah.
Yeah. You had a moment, I don't know if I have the quote here. You basically are talking about, oh, here it is. Sometimes the unseen is more terrifying than what's in view. What the imagination adds to the blank space, how it answers the open-ended questions. And there is just there's just so much in this book about thinking about finality and how, fiction, narrative gives us a space to work through, these questions that have no answers in our lived reality, like these open-ended questions. And yeah, I felt, especially in relation to suicide, that the essays do a really good job of complicating those feelings that oftentimes, as you point out, media tries to simplify as like, if we find the motive, then okay, that we can close the book on it, everybody's square. So it's
interesting. There's what's Joan Didion essay, we tell ourselves, or the quote, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. That's like the quote everyone kind of gloms onto. But if you extend and actually read that whole essay, she says, I think the line is, we look for the sermon in the suicide. And that whole essay ends up just being about the kind of narratives we impose. And in a sense, I think that's here, looking for that narrative, kind of reaching toward it. But I do think in a lot of ways those answers, they do elude us, because I think death and suicide, but death full stop, I think it's kind of beyond our reckoning in some ways. So all we can do is try and make sense of it, which I think horror tries to do in some ways. Some really loud ways, some really over-the-top ways. Maybe it makes us a little less afraid. I don't know. I'm not particularly fond of cabins, but, you know, I probably have the genre to thank for that. But, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that gets to, I think we were talking about this kind of before you came on, that so many of the different essays feel like they're playing with this idea of like why we're drawn to horror, like what draws in different people, and that, you know, almost across the collection it feels like there's like a shifting answer for maybe what it is about a particular genre of horror or a particular kind of series of tropes about like why we keep coming back to it. And I pulled the line in the essay about kind of dark tourism, because I thought this was a really good one. We've heard this one before. We know better. We're versed in urban legends. We know the ending. We listen because the story satisfies an urge towards darkness and promises relief. We are not in the story. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about like what is your relationship personally to horror, and like what do you think draws you in to these stories, and are there particular kind of horror tropes that you find yourself kind of vibing with or more attracted to, or like you keep coming back to in a way that maybe some other ones don't?
Yeah. Oh, I have so many favorite tropes and vibes. I think initially it's so funny that this book came to be, because initially I think a lot of my early horror experiences I felt almost excluded from the genre, or I felt almost like there was no access point. Like I had past boyfriends kind of explaining horror to me, which is always, I think just any person explaining something to me in a way that feels condescending is never fun. So there were those experiences, but I found that the more I watched, and, you know, kind of watching some of the, some older horror, so like Dario Argento is a favorite of mine. There's something really dreamy and also super horrifying about those movies. But they're just like these Technicolor like dreamscapes where I love that, you know, all the bright colors, the neon, and I love the music too. And so when I think about that experience, which just felt a little more dreamy to me, it didn't feel as like, it felt like something I could slip into a bit easier, because I love dreamy lyrical art. It's just a love of mine. And then, you know, from there I kind of just fell down the rabbit hole, and it was everything, you know, watching, you know, Freddy, watching, you know, newer films as they came out, and just finding my way through those. But in terms of films that I love, I think I'm definitely drawn to stories about women. So, you know, Rosemary's Baby was definitely one that I saw earlier on, and that stuck with me. It Follows, of course. But I think too, again, as we mentioned, that one kind of breaks the mold in that I don't think anyone's excluded from that monster. You know, women and men and everyone in between can, you know, die from that creature or presence, force, whatever it is. But definitely the trope of women, and particularly the final girl, the one who survives, definitely resonates and lands with me. And I think we've seen that expanding in recent years too. Like, there are definitely quieter iterations, right? So it doesn't have to be Jamie Lee Curtis screaming, as much as I love Jamie Lee Curtis. And now we have, you know, quieter, more pacey films like The Witch, you know, something like that is just really cool to watch and witness. Or like Midsummer, which I don't even know how to qualify that movie. Like, it's horror for sure, but I don't even know what trope I call it. Weird cult experience. Right, well, it's Wicker Man. It's a callback to both Wicker Mans, right? Which are, I love those too. Yeah, I do also like the whole cult trope. That's definitely fun.
No, I like that because I also, I guess I've only come to horror recently. I'm a giant baby, and so I think for a long time, and especially I think maybe the types of horror that were getting made when I was in like high school and stuff was like the Saw adjacent stuff where it's like more graphic, and I was like, I just don't think I like this. Like, I don't think this is for me. And I think only recently I've been like, oh, like it doesn't always have to be that way. It can be a more kind of psychological, or it can be more about like angsty, I guess, and that tends to vibe with me more. And I think more recently being like, oh, okay, there's some things in here that I can take something away from that feels more welcoming.
I remember the Saw movies. Those were very just I actually used to love those, like when I was younger. Like, for some reason, like my friends and I loved Saw. Like, we thought it was we thought it was very intelligent. I think the literary device we noticed as high schoolers was symbolic retribution. Like, the people were dying by by their sins, which is of course like a ripoff of Seven, which is way better than Saw. I do a really good Brad Pitt at the end of that, asking what's in the box. I won't.
I mean,
I feel like it feels a little bit like you did open the door on this.
What's in the box? What's in the box?
Yeah, I think we've been.
Sorry, I had to. You asked.
I love that you brought up your love of horror that's centered around female characters or femininity, because we've talked a lot about like horror film within the collection, but another through line that I found was this ruminations on femininity and the breaking of patriarchal molds of femininity. Like, I love the essays that are about like the pageants, about ballet, and your descriptions of your own experiences within those times feel almost like horror. Like how you're describing, like there's the moment of the mother you're getting ready for to go on stage, and the mother next to you working with her daughter, she like hits her with a brush or something like that, and it's kind of like these cracks in the facade of what we expect is supposed to be like pure and beautiful and perfect. And I'm wondering, did those kinds of through lines, whether it be the pageants or the ballet essay or things like that, did those come later as you were kind of formulating what the collection was going to ultimately be about, or was that also something that you had just been ruminating from the beginning?
I think it was something, so I think that figures into a lot of my work. In my first collection of poems, I had a really brief series, and each poem was told from the persona, the voice of a different final girl, and they weren't necessarily each called like, oh, this is my poem from Rosemary's voice. They weren't that conspicuous or deliberate, but I knew I was writing them from that place. And I think femininity and those more typical or previously typical, because now I feel like there's no typical femininity, right? That's something I've always orbited in my work, is just this kind of fascination with and dread of what it means to be a woman, but also what does it mean to be a man, because to understand oh, this is how women are supposed to behave, in quotes. Probably I have to have some understanding of, this is how men are expected to behave, or, now it's, I think we're seeing I think we've been seeing that binary just split. It's fractured. There's no more of it. And so I guess this is, kind of making sense of those earliest experiences that really drove home those really traditional modes of femininity and moving through the world. And how violent some of them are, right? Like you mentioned the mother hitting her daughter with a hairbrush. But, we can expand that to all sorts of treatments of the body. And so it was something I definitely found myself thinking about. And also with ballet and just the enormous attention that lands on the body and the shape of the body, at the same time as the demands that are made, right? It's like this very physical movement that requires a lot, and yet how small we were encouraged to be. Yeah, it's unreal.
Yeah, the Suspiria essay, I've only seen the new, like the remake, that came out, what was a couple years ago now, and I'll just say you did a very good job of putting me back into that traumatic scene of like the mirror room, like body horror part, which was just like, great juxtaposition, I think, with what you're talking about, with the body in relation to dance and things like that.
Yeah, that scene is so, like, when I remember being in the theater for that seeing New Suspiria in the theater, when the scene I describe as a dancer basically being forced to dance by, like, a witchy force making her dance, and her body's just, like, breaking. I'll never forget, like, being in the theater and just, like, wilting in my seat. Like, this is not... this is just too much to take.
It's intense, yeah.
I think even watching it at home, I still, like... yeah. But the original one's really good, too. It has a couple of those very horrifying, just body-breaking scenes, too. So I would recommend that one, too. Yeah.
I don't know. You were kind of talking about it a bit before, but you have that essay about the final girl trope and how there's like this expectation that the final survivor is expected to kind of tell her story. Early in that essay, and again, I think you talked about this before, there's that scene where the then boyfriend argues that having a violent sexual assault scene in the movie was essential to kind of making its point. And I think so much of this collection feels like a refutation of the idea that violence needs to be kind of seen or expressed directly. And one of the things that you're just so good at is writing absence. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about what it's like to think about writing negative space in essays in order to convey meaning or convey feeling without ever saying a thing directly.
I think that's something that's really... it's really important to weigh in on and to consider, like, to think about the possibility, like, can you write about something without showing it? It's almost like asking, is a story still a story if nothing happens, right? Like, if it's a character sitting in a room thinking, is that still a story? Could that still be a story? I think it could be. And initially, I think early drafts of the essay you're referencing, where I'm writing about a boyfriend at the time saying we have to see this violence, and that expectation of the final girl not only saying her story, but repeating it, wanting to press back against that. So earlier drafts of that essay were a lot fuller, and I did write a lot more. But then I kind of, as I was like thinking about sending it out, I was like, I don't want this all out there. And I think I kind of was like banging my head against the wall, like writing more, writing less. And then finally I was like, why do I, like, can I make this like a framing device of the essay. Can I ask this question and make this the essay? Because right now we have a lot of people writing these essays, unfortunately. And I was like, maybe another addition to the conversation can be, you have an option. You can write this absence. You can take these details out. And I think another way that I came to that was I said, well, you're not explicitly detailing the descriptions of suicide or trying to weigh why people made that choice. So you can write a lot of things that I think we're conditioned to think, oh, I need to spell all this out, all these details. And it's fine to write it, but it's also fine as you revise to scale back and say, how can I move through the world with this existing out there? Like what's going to be okay for me in the end? And that's where I landed. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just like, boy, I mean, I think it's what made so many of these essays feel so kind of moving and effective is that like, I'm thinking about like the Jaws one, that it's like so much of it was about not saying the thing directly, but giving all of these kind of touch points. It's almost like the thing that is underwater is touching all these things above, and we're kind of getting the surface level. And so it's like not until the end are you able to kind of put all the pieces together and realize what a thing is about. I think a lot of the essays do this, where it's like it's like right around the kind of final paragraph, you're like, oh, this is about X. And that kind of feeling, that wave of like, oh, I've gotten all the kind of feelings and all these kind of moments and scenes around a thing, and suddenly it like hits you, was just like very impactful, like very emotionally impactful. And I just like, hey, like, how did you do that? Like I found myself, I think, continually being like, how is this moment happening, and like how is this being pulled off? Because I would keep getting to that final moment and just having that like, moment that was like just very effective. And so how do you think about, I guess, writing up to those points again without ever saying something directly?
I think in a lot of cases I ended up writing and then taking things out. So in a lot of cases I do say the thing, I do write the, you know, the ghost that's missing, but it gets left on the in some old draft. In addition to like doing the note cards on the wall, I also will print drafts up and I'll cut them up paragraph by paragraph and I'll move pieces around. So in a sense, the book and my writing in a lot of ways does end up genuinely being collage. And it's just looking for things to click into place. Like I wish I had, I feel like I'd write so much faster. I'd get so much more done if I had like the secret, if I knew the secret to like, oh, this is when it's done. But in the end, it ends up being this kind of, it is intentional because I'm moving pieces around and I'm thinking, okay, there's definitely this arc here. But it's one of those, like, when you know things. And it's the result of, like, being like, this isn't it so many times, right? It's the result of printing something up or looking at a draft and saying, this isn't quite right. Like, I just have to step away from it for a while. Or I need to take this out. Or I need to add something in here. Or I need to move and topple this whole thing, write it backwards. I mean, those are all really like simple sounding, almost like, I'd argue like my really critical self says those are like almost hack sounding things to try. But I mean, when I do some of those revision strategies, that's how I tap into things that I hadn't considered before, or I find, oh, this is actually the pulse of the piece. This is what I'm actually writing about.
Yeah, I think I relate to that a lot. Just something that I used to tell students when I was teaching during my MFA is just like how much people discredit the visual element of writing, regardless of whether there's actually any kind of visual there. Just being able to see it, whether it be printing it out, putting it up, or like you, I also cut up, essays and kind of rearrange things and see them in different ways. And that's for me has always been one of the fun parts about it, is just seeing this kind of what emerges from the surface once you kind of break it apart, or like you said, like write more than you need and then maybe cut off half of it or put it somewhere else. It's amazing. I don't know. It feels like magic.
And it feels sometimes like I said, I'm like, oh, I feel like such a hack being like, oh, I move stuff. But it's really true. Like when you just print something up and you're like, okay, well, I killed the tree, so I'm going to force myself to like move pieces around and just re-envision this. Like, I don't know. It's kind of like you can worry about it and think, oh, this is good enough. Or you can just like overhaul it and say, yeah, I'm just going to re-see this in a new way. It doesn't always work, but when it does, it's quite nice.
Was any of the work in the collection, like thinking back to your years in the MFA, I'm always curious, like one, did some of this project start back then, and two, if it did, like what was kind of the reception back then? Because I think we can all relate to different workshop experiences where certain essays just, they're going to get tore up in the workshop experience when they're like perfectly fine, and that this has to do with, kind of like the canon of the workshop, like what's kind of the expectations, what are people doing? So I'm curious, like, yeah, what was your general experience in the MFA, and how did that relate to this project, if it did?
So I was in the MFA program at Syracuse from 2009 through 2012. I went right after undergrad, and I had done my undergrad there. And so this book, I didn't start this one till like 2016. I started this book in 2016. So this was years after the MFA, about 4 years after. And my first collection of poems was my MFA thesis. And I found in general, like at the time though, I did do a lot of like the kind of dreamy writing. I wrote prose poems. That was my whole MFA thesis. And one thing I loved about the program I attended was we were really encouraged to cross-pollinate. So poets could take fiction classes, fiction writers could take poetry classes. I was enrolled in poetry, so I was taking short story classes with George Saunders. I could have taken memoir with Mary Carr. It's really nice that they let you just kind of find your way through it, and they encourage you to not only like take those classes, but to read beyond what you're there for. And I love that approach, because for me, that's the only way I've ever known how to work. So of course I'll love it. But I also think it's the way I grow. It's the way it's the way I thrive, is working in different forms. I did take a Maymester with Minnie Bruce Pratt as well, and we did lyric essays with the collage form. So while I wasn't there for nonfiction, I did get to have that experience. And I do remember like we snipped up drafts and moved them around, and I remember like my final project for that Maymester was like, I had all the pieces spread out on a floor. I can't even remember what that essay was about, but I was moving all the pieces around, and I guess I carried that forward. But it would be, I would be interested to just like, I don't know, be in a workshop and see what happened to this book. Maybe not. Maybe not. I don't know. It'd be, I had a good MFA experience. I know that's not the case for everyone. I think too, there's something about it that like by the end of it, everyone's kind of like, you have a sense of what some people might say. It's almost like a pressure cooker. But I loved like getting reading recommendations. It shaved years off my like wandering and trying to find, more writers whose work I would love. I mean, in addition to like the whole experience, I feel like the reading list I carried away was just so valuable to me. And it sustains me, like knowing I did that. Like I got to do that, not to be like the kid who never left high school, but it does, like that advice, like when you hear people say like it's really hard to keep writing, but it's really important to keep doing it if you want to, or you can quit if you want to. It is nice to have like that sense of perspective. Like the world's not going to end if I stop writing. My world would feel like it's ending, but the world, like, in the larger sense, doesn't hinge on me, like, in this office doing this. Mine does, but...
I kind of wanted to go back and just ask this question about so many of these essays feel really personal, and I think I've been thinking a lot about this in the context of like creative nonfiction generally, and this idea of like who gets to tell a story, especially when it's like a family story or it's a shared experience. There's a scene kind of late in the book when the mom is cataloging the family's history of suicide after your uncle's killed himself, and I was thinking about that history kind of showing up in that essay, and do you share these essays and do you talk with your mom about this stuff, and how do you negotiate? You were kind of talking about this before, which is like, how do you share these things with the world, and like whose are they to share, and what does that whole negotiation look like?
Yeah, that's I'm really lucky that I have a very supportive family. Like, no one's called me like screaming like, how could you write this?
Right.
But I also think the dreamy kind of, like we were talking about, writing absence and maybe not going too heavy on the detail. Maybe that gets me a little leeway. So my husband's also a writer, and I think when I was, it was a really early embarrassing draft, but I did share it with him, and I was like, can you just like tell me if this early draft, which had a lot more detail, I was like, can you tell me if this like passes the am I embarrassing people sniff test? Like, can you just tell me if this is like unseemly or just too much, or am I just like gawking? And so I didn't go to all my family and ask permission, or, I imagine I probably, could have. But I was like, I'm just going to do it and hope. What is it? It's better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission.
Yeah. Well, I'm even like what is a gawk test? I love that as an idea, but like what does a gawk test look like?
I think so one thing I told myself was like, just make the writing really good. Like, make it really good, and then they can't be mad. Like, I don't know that if that worked. But a gawk test, when I was thinking of gawk test, I was thinking like, does it feel like I just am telling all this stuff and just exhuming all this stuff with no self-reflection, with no sense of myself maybe coming across as not always the best person? Like, are there equal parts like, oh, these are these family, the realities of our family, but also like, these are my realities or things I've experienced. And I think when you're willing to lay yourself on the line too, like, maybe embarrass yourself a little bit. People tend to be warmer to the sharing in that personal sense. I do think it's something that, like, if someone came to me and they said like, this was too much, it was too personal, I'd certainly apologize for that. But I would never not write something because I was worried. I would at least give it a shot. I would at least give it a try. It is hard though, because I think it's a fine line. But I do think like writing, when you take the time and you really mull over an idea or an experience, you're going to come to a better place. You're going to come to a higher, it's not just going to be, oh, I'm going to, type out all this horrible family stuff. You're hopefully elevating and reaching towards something higher, something more illuminating about people, and
Yeah. No, I like that idea a lot, that it's like what passes the gawk test is less of like here's all the stuff my family's been doing, or here's all the stuff that is going on, and more of like, here's what this stuff says about some broader idea, whether it be grief or trauma or that if it's plugging into those larger things, then to some degree it like matters less that it includes these kind of personal details.
Well, now that the book is out in the world, I'm curious, like what are you working on now? Like, is there any kind of new things cooking up in the slow cooker?
Yeah, it's a slow cooker, all right. um, it's slow. So the summer I was thinking about sending this one out, I started writing, I was writing some fiction. So we'll see where that goes. Hoping for novel. That's the goal, is a novel. But it'll take me so long. Like this one took like 4 or 5, with publication 5 years. So the idea of a novel is a little daunting. We'll see if the whole prose poem after prose poem trick works again.
Concept works in a novel setting. I'm here for it.
I don't think I'll be like taping that one to the wall at this point. I tried last summer to tape the draft of the novel to the wall, and it was just, I was like, this office is way too tiny for this approach. So like I have a great picture of my cat and me, just like we're just hanging out in this office and we're both just surrounded by pages. It's pretty great. Yeah.
So Gina, I think we're running out of questions. Is there something we haven't asked you that you maybe want to mention?
I think I've been really enjoying the conversation and your questions. I didn't have anything else in mind to bring up.
Do you is there a section of the book that you maybe want to read for us?
Let's do one from the It Follows, because I think I think we've agreed that's one of both of your favorites. So let's go with that.
That essay rules. You're not wrong.
Okay, good. Let's go with that. Let's do this one. Her boyfriend rummages in the trunk. She lies across the seat in her underwear, stretches an arm out the open door. Her hand brushes flowering weeds sprouted from concrete in the lot, and she says,
"It's funny.
I used to daydream about being old enough to go on dates. I had this image of myself, holding hands with a really cute guy, listening to the radio,
driving on some pretty road, up north maybe. The trees started to change colors. It's never about going anywhere, really.
Just having some sort of freedom, I guess."
Gina, thank you so much for
this was really
taking
fun.
the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you
it's
both
been great
so
talking
much.
To you.
It was wonderful to talk with you.
I guess I actually do have one small little question left for our listeners. What's like the Gina Nutt like 3 horror movies they should watch that are some of your favorites?
Okay, so my favorites, top 3, I would say A Nightmare on Elm Street, Suspiria. The Dario Argento is my favorite, but you can mix and match with that or the new one, and It Follows.
Nice.
So those are my 3 favorites.
Damn.
I could go on forever, but we'll do those 3.
Listen, that's a good lineup.
This was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was fantastic. Your questions were so wonderful. Yeah.
Best of luck, and listen, when that novel finally hits, call us. We're ready.
Oh, thanks. I'll keep that in mind.
And that was our conversation with Gina Nutt on her awesome essay collection, Night Rooms. Man, it was such a good conversation. Again, just thinking about, I think the biggest takeaway for me was this whole call and response kind of conversation around horror, and how horror is a response to to an action as opposed to the action itself, and how that relates to the personal. That was kind of a big thing I've been thinking a lot about with the conversation.
Yeah. I think my big takeaway is that we should find a way to clip her doing the impersonation of Brad Pitt saying what's in the box and put that online so people can just use it, I think, anytime that they want to.
Oh no, that's gonna be that's a origin story original podcast.
Perfect meme content right there.
Yeah. No, but we just want to thank Gina Nutt again for coming on the show. Really great conversation, really great book. And it is available most places, $2 Radio, other retailers. And you can find more of her work in a variety of places online, but an easy way to look is at ginanut.com.
Yeah, and if you follow us on Twitter at @originstory_, we'll, I think in the kind of after this comes out, we'll do a little tweet thread where you can find some of her essays that have been published online, so you can get a sense kind of for how good her stuff is.
Yeah, and Gina doesn't use social media very often, so we don't have any socials to drop for her, but you can find us at @originstory_, or my personal Twitter is at 3DCisco. And where can they find you, Ben?
At sad_radio_lad.
Love that name.
Thanks.
Thanks again.
I feel like I just want to say this one thing, which is sometimes serious people will tag me, and I'm just like, wow, imagine this serious person writing out at sad radio lad. It brings joy to my heart.
I mean, it's really a power play in a lot of senses. Thanks to Ryan Hopper for providing the music for this episode, and thanks to Melody Hirsch for doing the awesome cover art. And if you have questions, concerns, ideas, or if you just want to tell us something cool, you can email us at theoriginstorypod@gmail.com.
It has to be really cool. I think we need to point out that there's a high threshold of cool before you email us. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we were definitely the cool kids back in the day, so just keeping that energy going.
Woof.
But we will catch you all again here soon on the next interview.
Yeah.
Peace.
Catch ya.